Minecraft, when it was first introduced to the public in its alpha and beta stages, devoid of overt narrative or detailed guidance, created an atmosphere that players often described as strangely haunting. Sparse landscapes, unknown mobs, long silences, and subtle audio cues gave rise to a feeling that something unseen was always nearby. An eerie emotional register wasn't necessarily intentional, but emerged organically through a confluence of design decisions and the psychological response of players encountering an unfamiliar digital world. Early Minecraft had no music for long stretches of gameplay, and when the music did come, it appeared at arbitrary intervals. The minimal, melancholic piano melodies by C418, such as Sweden or Subwoofer Lullaby, to name a few, arrived unannounced, often during the quietest moments. It felt like it wasn't just you, it was you and someone who had been here before. Ambient sounds like the echoing wind in caves, sudden drips of water, and distant growls, these random assortments of sounds, playing at random intervals, just helped amplify the sense of isolation. These auditory elements contributed to a low-level dread that stayed with players long after they exited the game. Visually, the early terrain generation was unpredictable and occasionally unsettling. Players often encountered floating islands, abrupt biome transitions, or sheer cliff faces with bizarre overhangings. A bunch of random anomalies. And these anomalies, while the result of rudimentally procedural generation algorithms, gave the impression that the world was glitched or tampered with, evoking feelings of being in a simulation that's slightly askew from reality. In a way, these unrefined landscapes mirrored the terrain of the uncanny. It was recognizable and yet subtly wrong. Even without the presence of visible threats, the game suggested that danger could arise from the environment itself, and this was shown particularly in Nightfall. Nightfall was particularly evocative. Without ample resources, players were often left exposed to the elements, with mobs like zombies and skeletons lurking just beyond the light. The transition from day to night was not only mechanical, but emotional. As opposed to more modern versions where it's this gradient, it's a gradual transition, these just went from beat to beat to beat to beat until it was completely, unbearably dark. The game shifted from exploration to survival, plunging players into darkness where they could barely see a few feet ahead of them. The flickering of torches and the crackle of fire offered the only sense of safety, often reinforcing rather than alleviating the fear of what lay beyond. What distinguished Minecraft from traditional horror games was that it didn't rely on jump scares or overt grotesquerie. Its eeriness emerged from absence, not presence. The lack of NPCs in the earliest versions meant players were completely alone. There were no towns, no villages, no villagers, no written signs of civilization. The world seemed ancient and untouched, but also as if it had been abandoned. This blank canvas of solitude allowed the mind to project its own fears into the game, often turning mundane things into sources of discomfort. Players would frequently report sensations of being watched or followed even when no mobs were present, a psychological byproduct of a world that felt too quiet and too open. The psychological effect of early Minecraft's atmosphere can be partially explained through the lens of environmental storytelling and spatial design. Without direct narrative, the game relied on the player's interpretation of its spaces. A dark cave wasn't just a resource pit, it became a place where the unknown lingered. A forest wasn't just a cluster of trees, it was a potential site of danger, where movement in the shadows could mean an ambush or worse. It's crucial to note that this haunting atmosphere wasn't engineered with psychological manipulation in mind. Instead, it was a byproduct of computational and developmental limitations. The minimal sound design wasn't a stylistic flourish, but a consequence of limited memory and audio implementation. Terrain generation was rudimentary because the algorithm hadn't yet been refined. But these constraints led to emergent storytelling where players projected narratives onto a world that felt alien yet strangely familiar. This kind of eeriness is rare in modern games, particularly in an era dominated by polished AAA titles with clearly defined mechanics. Minecraft's earlier versions operated in a different register, one that left players with a lingering sense of mystery. In an era before detailed wikis or these Markiplier gameplay videos, much of what occurred in Minecraft was undocumented, giving each world an individualized mythology. This lack of centralized knowledge made strange occurrences feel personal and therefore more disturbing. And as the game evolved, many of the unsettling aspects were dulled by updates that added structure like villages, trading objectives, and, clear mechanics. While these expanded the player base and solidified Minecraft's place in gaming history, it also chipped away at the eerie loneliness that defined its earlier years. This loneliness that I love so much. Players today may not experience the same trepidation when venturing into the unknown, as the mystery has been replaced with familiarity and Jack Black. The sandbox remains, but the sandbox no longer whispers. One of the most understated yet profoundly effective contributors to early Minecraft's haunting atmosphere was its audio design. In many ways, it was what the game didn't say that made it the most disturbing. Prior to the implementation of more complex soundscapes and ambient environmental effects, Minecraft operated in a space of near silence, punctuated by sparse and often incongruous audio cues. This minimalism, though not designed to be unsettling, inadvertently created an auditory environment where dread could quickly fester. The default soundscape of early Minecraft was barren. Most of the time, players heard nothing more than their own footsteps, or maybe the breaking of blocks, or the occasional environmental effect, such as water or lava, because that's really all there was. Without background noise to provide a sense of safety or context, the quiet became oppressive. In survival mode especially, long periods of total silence made every unexpected sound, be it the grunt of a zombie or like the crack of a skeleton's bow, whatever, shockingly loud. These abrupt intrusions didn't just alert the player to danger, they forced them into a heightened state of awareness where this absence of sound felt more threatening than the presence of it. Minecraft's ambient cave sounds are perhaps the most disturbing element of unintentional horror through audio, although I have a feeling that it is intentional. Listen to some of these. These sounds, like low rumbles and distant howls, like metal clanging together and breathing and whatnot, played randomly when the player entered certain light-level conditions underground. Crucially, they were non-diegetic. They didn't correspond to any actual event or entity in the game world. The player might be completely alone in a cave only to hear what sounded like a tortured animal or like a metal bar hitting something, or maybe even a faint whisper. These noises had no mechanical purpose nor any gameplay relevance. They existed purely as atmosphere. From a design perspective, the randomness and lack of explanation surrounding these cave sounds generated deep discomfort. They sound horrifying. The human brain is hardwired to interpret certain audio patterns, especially those resembling breathing or footsteps or moans, as indicative of nearby life. When such cues are presented without a source, the mind creates its own justification. In Minecraft, this meant imagining hidden mobs or supernatural presences in places where simply nothing existed. The game's refusal to explain these sounds allowed them to take on mythic qualities. Online forums were filled with speculation. Were the sounds tied to White Eyes or Herobrine? Were they remnants of an abandoned feature? Or were they clues to something? Adding to the sense of uneasiness was the score, composed by C418, as I stated earlier. Early Minecraft music was strangely melancholic, appearing at random and often fading in during quiet moments rather than dramatic ones. They did not fit the mold of what one would expect from a survival sandbox game. They were somber, ambient piano pieces, and gentle synth tracks that evoked a sense of loneliness and loss rather than excitement. The music could begin when a player stood alone on a mountaintop, or while wandering a desert with no mobs in sight. This created a contrast between the gameplay and the soundtrack, which would create what I would call cognitive dissonance. The player might be fortifying a shelter against monsters, yet the music evoked sadness. In the context of early Minecraft's minimal textures and vast uninhabited world, the music was a reinforcement of the idea that the player was truly alone. And this loneliness, drawn out over hours of gameplay, gave rise to a uniquely quiet form of psychological horror, one rooted not in jump scares, but in existential solitude. Another subtle but impactful audio element was Minecraft's directional ambiguity. Before improvements to stereo panning, it was often difficult to determine exactly where a noise was coming from. A zombie groan could echo through stone walls, leaving players to spin in circles, digging frantically to locate the source. The hiss of a creeper might seem to come from behind, but actually be a glitch or residual sound, something like that. These audio illusions caused panic and a mistrust of people's perceptions of what they were experiencing, a deep-seated anxiety that the world could not fully be known or understood. Interestingly, there were also sound-related bugs that furthered this atmosphere. Occasionally, sounds would play globally, meaning a sound made far away from the player could still be heard faintly, as if it were right next to them. This included like doors opening and explosions or other player-made sounds in multiplayer servers. In the absence of visible cues, these sounds were often misinterpreted as evidence of another presence, whether real or imagined. Stories of players hearing doors opened in abandoned mine shafts or the sound of footsteps above ground while caving alone became commonplace and fed into the wider mythology of haunted Minecraft worlds. This was a consistent undermining of safety. Players were rarely given clear feedback about their environment. Sounds came without sources, music evoked emotion without narrative, silence filled the gaps between interactions. This ambiguity fostered a climate where fear was thriving. And the most horrifying element of all is Herobrine. Herobrine is among the most persistent and widely recognized legends to emerge from early Minecraft. A mysterious figure with white eyes, which I will cover in a bit, who appeared in single-player worlds and just stalked the player and altered the environment in subtle but unsettling ways. Herobrine's origin is notoriously difficult to pin down, as it emerged not from the game itself, but from the community's collective imagination. The first widely acknowledged mention of Herobrine can be traced back to a 2010 post on the Minecraft forums, where a user claimed to have encountered a strange human-like figure in their single-player world. According to this post, this figure behaved unnaturally, standing still in the fog, removing leaves from trees and creating small pyramids of sand in the ocean. The user claimed they tried to engage other players about this incident, only to find their forum posts deleted. Eventually, they received an ominous message from someone claiming to be Herobrine, and the user concluded the character was the dead brother of Minecraft's creator Marcus Persson, or Notch. What made this narrative compelling was its presentation. The original post was formatted like a creepypasta, which it was trying to be a creepypasta, and it employed classic storytelling techniques like ambiguity and isolation, most importantly. The idea that Herobrine was Notch's deceased brother was purely fictional, yet the inclusion of a real developer's name grounded the story in what could be recognizable. This fusion of digital myth with the real-world context was blurring the lines of fiction and fact. It made Herobrine seem strangely real. The psychological mechanism at play here is called pareidolia. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The brain's tendency to interpret vague patterns as something meaningful. This is why people see faces in clouds or hear words in static. In Minecraft, with its unpredictable lighting and low-resolution textures, pareidolia runs rampant. Fog, once a performance feature in early versions of the game, unintentionally contributed to this phenomenon. When your render distance is cut to 8 or 10 chunks, anything moving in and out of visibility is shrouded in ambiguity. That creates fertile ground for paranoia. It's not just that white eyes might be real, it's that they could be just barely out of reach, lurking around the corners. Players reported seeing pairs of white pixels in the woods, in cave entrances, even reflected in water. Sometimes it was a sheep's face, or the flicker of a torch. But once the idea was planted, once someone expected to see white eyes, their brain began interpreting all visual anomalies with that lens. Minecraft is, at its core, a game of minimalism. Its textures are blocky, its lighting is primitive, and yet the human brain, so adept at pattern recognition, fills in the blanks. One white pixel glitch in the darkness of a cave becomes a face. A brief flash of light in the fog becomes an apparition. The white eyes phenomenon thrives in this minimalist environment. Eyes, especially ones without pupils, taps directly into our fear of the unnatural. There's something deeply unsettling about being watched by a figure that shows no emotion and no expression. It's just us, but different. Just glowing white sockets where human life should be. In Minecraft, this becomes more than just an aesthetic feature. It plays on the player's psychological state during nighttime exploration. The mind is alert, adrenaline is high, and the player's senses are heightened. Combine that with Minecraft's random sound cues and its vast, lonely landscapes, and it's not hard to understand why white eyes linger in so many memories. Despite being quickly debunked by Notch himself, who clarified that he had no brother, the Herobrine myth took on a life of its own. Players began to report sightings, share screenshots, many doctored, and trade strategies for avoiding or summoning Herobrine. And numerous YouTube videos surfaced claiming to capture Herobrine's appearance in-game, often accompanied by ominous music or jump cuts or whatever to fake it. What began as a forum post rapidly evolved into a pervasive shared fiction, powered by the same mechanics that drive urban legends. And in this vast loneliness of Minecraft, the idea of a ghostly figure watching from the distance filled this psychological vacuum. This myth leveraged the very qualities that made Minecraft feel unsettling. The emptiness, the silence, the sense of being observed without knowing by whom. These were not new ideas in the horror genre, but their application in a sandbox game with no explicit narrative gave them a uniquely personal dimension. The role of confirmation bias is very real here. Once players believed in Herobrine, they began to interpret environmental anomalies as signs of his presence. A chunk loading improperly, or maybe a strange structure generated by the terrain engine, any of these could be reframed as evidence. Minecraft's procedural generation by nature produces strange, improbable formations. Herobrine offered an explanation that felt more satisfying than randomness. Herobrine's myth was sustained and amplified by the game's openness to modding. Several community-created mods introduced Herobrine into the game, complete with new behavior scripts and attacks and everything that Herobrine would do in these creepypastas. These mods, while unofficial, gave players the ability to experience the legend firsthand. Some players, and especially younger ones, myself included, had difficulty distinguishing between modded and vanilla experiences, reinforcing Herobrine's status as a semi-canonical ghost in the machine. Interestingly, Mojang played into the myth by occasionally including removed Herobrine in official patch notes, a tongue-in-cheek acknowledgement that helped keep the legend alive. These entries acted as a meta-commentary on the community's obsession and became an inside joke that walked a fine line between dismissal and endorsement. This semi-official stance helped Herobrine occupy a unique space, that he was not part of the game, but he wasn't entirely outside of it either. His legend didn't arise from the developer's design, but from the player's psychological engagement with the world. And from a marketing perspective, Herobrine unintentionally boosted Minecraft's visibility. The myth drove content creation like videos, stories, mods, theories, whatever you want, that brought in new players curious to see the ghost for themselves. They had measurable economic value and increased watch time. While much of Minecraft's early eeriness is rooted in atmosphere and myth, there were also mechanical elements, specifically related to mob behavior, that contributed to a sense of uneasiness. Before Minecraft's AI systems were refined and made a hell of a lot better, many of the game's entities behaved in unpredictable and unsettling ways. These behaviors, whether due to bugs or the likes, often gave rise to disturbing experiences that lingered in players' memories. The mobs in early Minecraft did not merely pose a threat to player survival. Their strangeness suggested a world that was not entirely under control, one where logic occasionally bent or broke. Even more disconcerting were mob glitches that caused abnormal behaviors, such as zombies that occasionally spawned and moved in large groups, bunching at the edges of lit areas or standing in windows with no apparent AI directive. Spiders, when caught in odd terrain formations, would jitter in place or scale walls rapidly, making them appear erratic and unnatural. Skeletons sometimes continued firing after their target had moved out of range, creating the illusion that they were firing at something invisible. These behaviors weren't part of any deliberate horror mechanic, but they tapped into deep-seated anxiety, specifically the fear of unpredictability and this loss of control. Creepers were themselves the result of a mistake. Originally, they were intended to be a pig, a coding error flipping the X and Y values of the model, resulting in the tall, unnatural silhouette we now associate with creepers. This accident, the mob's silent approach, and this sudden detonation created one of the most anxiety-inducing elements in the game. And in early builds, creepers had less predictable paths and sometimes exploded even when players were at a theoretically safe distance, especially due to lag or incorrect collision calculations. These inconsistencies made their threat feel more random and terrifying. The dread they inspired wasn't just from the damage they could do, but from their defiance of expected behavior. Occasionally, hostile mobs would spawn in what were thought to be safe areas. Poor lighting calculations meant that players could experience sudden attacks inside what they believed to be fully lit homes. This phenomenon, monsters spawning in the one overlooked dark corner, was frequent in early versions and directly contributed to Minecraft's reputation as a game that didn't always play by its own rules. Even in multiplayer servers, these anomalies became more pronounced due to latency, which created illusions of mobs teleporting, vanishing, or just attacking from impossible angles. Friendly mobs weren't exempt from strange behavior either. Pigs, cows, and sheep in early versions exhibited pathfinding issues, often clustering in one area, walking in circles or walking off cliffs, just walking in the strangest areas. And occasionally, players would find animals trapped in caves or inside the walls of generated terrain, raising questions about how they got there. While likely a side effect of chunk generation and poor entity collision detection, these moments gave the impression of a world that was broken in ways the player wasn't meant to understand. The terrain generator in early Minecraft was based on Perlin noise, a type of gradient noise often used in procedural generation. Its purpose was to create naturalistic variation across the map, but in practice, before biome smoothing and logic-driven structure placement were refined, the generator would create formations that defied both real-world geography and internal consistency. Entire chunks of land would float in the sky with no support. Ravines would shear through the earth with brutal, unnatural precisions. Mountains would spawn with perfectly flat sides as if sliced by a colossal, invisible hand. Some worlds would include vast empty plains followed by sudden vertical spikes or chasms that extended beyond the visible fog. These were not necessarily bugs. They were the result of emergent properties within the system that hadn't yet fully been constrained. But because Minecraft was never explicit about its mechanics, players often filled in gaps with meaning. Why would a cave system form a perfect ring? Why were some mountains hollow on the inside? Why did a line of trees appear in perfect symmetry across a ridge? The more bizarre the terrain, the more likely it was to be interpreted as intentional, or worse, symbolic. Seed generation added another layer of mystique. Every Minecraft world was created from a seed, a string of numbers or characters that acted as a blueprint for all terrain and structure placement. In early versions, seeds were less understood by the general player base, and entering a random or odd seed sometimes led to uncanny effects. Some users began experimenting with seeds such as 666 or Herobrine, expecting and occasionally claiming that these strings led to haunted worlds. Whether through coincidence or manipulated screenshots, such seeds quickly became central to Minecraft's growing aura of mystery. It's essential to recognize the role of psychological priming in these experiences. When players entered a world expecting something strange or threatening, their interpretations of the terrain became skewed toward that expectation. A normal cave might seem larger, more oppressive. A pit might be perceived as a trap. An oddly shaped cliff could suddenly resemble a structure, perhaps a ruined monument or a message etched into the landscape. This tendency to project meaning onto randomness is a well-documented cognitive bias known as apophenia. Minecraft's procedural worlds, by virtue of their randomness and silence, became blank slates for the imagination to run wild. Then there were actual world generation bugs, true errors in the code that led to truly broken results. In some versions, terrain failed to render, creating infinite voids or fragmented floating biomes that looked like they had been shattered. Structures like mine shafts or dungeons would occasionally spawn at surface level or in midair, giving the impression of abandoned or ruined civilizations. And since early Minecraft lacked tutorialization, or detailed patch notes, many players had no way of knowing whether they were seeing what was intended or if they had stumbled upon something not meant to be seen. Minecraft, for all of its simplicity, is built on consistent systems. But when those systems break, or appear to, players are left to interpret the break. In horror design, this technique is often deliberate, a brief departure from the expected to induce discomfort. Minecraft achieved it accidentally, but no less effectively. The juxtaposition of serene music and glitch-ridden landscapes made the experience feel all the more surreal. One particularly disturbing terrain glitch involved chunk errors, where entire sections of the world would load incorrectly or not at all. These chunks might appear as blank squares or mismatched biome fragments. Walking into these spaces sometimes caused the game to crash or corrupt save files, which helped to reinforce the idea that certain parts of the world were cursed. Players would report their stories of exploring these glitched zones only for their world to become unplayable afterwards, further fueling folklore about specific coordinates being dangerous or forbidden. The concept of haunted coordinates emerged from these experiences. Players began sharing locations, specific XYZ positions where strange things consistently happened. One of the more disturbing psychological effects of early Minecraft exploration was the idea of unreachable or corrupted coordinates. Players who use teleportation commands or mods to travel to coordinates millions of blocks from spawn, regions often referred to as the Far Lands or Striped Lands, encountered bizarre and distorted terrain. In pre-beta versions, these areas featured broken geometry and floating landmasses with completely unstable lighting and flickering textures. The engine itself struggled to interpret the data, creating landscapes that looked like errors in reality. These locations didn't just appear wrong, they felt wrong. They were what digital theorist Nick Montfort might call procedural uncanny, spaces generated by logic but devoid of reason. The Farlands in particular have taken on legendary status in Minecraft folklore. First appearing around 12,550,821 blocks from the world origin, this region was the result of floating point precision errors in the terrain generator. The world here became jagged and hollow, towering walls with mismatched terrain that reached the sky with deep chasms and broken lighting below. For many players, reaching the Farlands felt like crossing into forbidden space, where the rules of the game and the nature had ceased to apply. The very concept of a place so far removed from normality, existing only from computational malfunction, carried an unsettling weight. It was as if the world itself had a boundary not just in space, but in sanity. While the Farlands were eventually removed in later versions, specifically Beta 1.8, they continue to haunt the game's mythology, and their existence was never fully explained in detail by Mojang, and the removal wasn't accompanied by any in-universe rationale. The anxiety provoked by procedural generation also extended to vertical space. As caves and ravines became deeper and more complex, players often encountered levels of darkness and silence that felt utterly alien. Before the addition of Deep Slate, Dripstone, and the Warden, Minecraft's caves were less decorative and more oppressive, and these early cave systems had no guiding light or path. A single wrong turn could leave a player wandering for hours with no coal, no torches, and no recognizable landmarks. The experience resembled being buried alive in stone, with only the dull sounds of footsteps, your own footsteps, echoing through the black. Early cave generation often produced rooms without entrances, fully enclosed voids of darkness beneath the surface. Players who mined into these rooms by accident often found themselves disoriented, encountering waterless lakes and floating gravel or even inexplicably lit spaces. There was no gameplay reason for these rooms to exist. They were artifacts of randomness, mathematical ghosts rendered in stone and dirt. Yet they felt intentional, as if someone or something had carved them out before abandoning them. The mind craves pattern, and it invents agency. There is a growing body of literature around liminal spaces and digital eeriness that helps explain the emotional response players had to early Minecraft. These environments operate in a state of in-betweenness, too artificial to be natural, too expansive to be designed. They evoke feelings of unease not through explicit threat, but through unresolved tension. Minecraft's early infinite worlds occupied this liminal space perfectly. endlessly explorable but directionless, full of possibility but devoid of narrative closure. Many of these incomplete elements contributed directly to Minecraft's unsettling tone. Players would often stumble across game mechanics that served no immediate purpose, only to realize later that these features had either been abandoned or were left deliberately vague. One of the most frequently cited examples was the presence of unused items or blocks within the game files. Before the implementation of proper creative mode and full item accessibility, players often used third-party tools like InvEdit and MCEdit, I don't know how to pronounce these, to browse the item database. There, they might discover objects that didn't spawn naturally. Glitched leaves with incorrect textures, unused data values, or even null blocks that, anything could really crash the game. Many players came across these anomalies without understanding their function. The game didn't explain them, nor did the developers offer thorough patch notes or changelogs for every build. Items like the Steve Head, which didn't appear in-game but could be summoned through commands, or the Ruby item that was later scrapped entirely, took on strange qualities. They felt like relics of an alternate version of Minecraft, one with a darker or more hidden narrative. Even now, discussions persist about the implications of these objects and why they were left in, or if they were mistakes. Perhaps even more evocative were the structures that seemed incomplete or directionless. Early iterations of dungeons, mine shafts, and strongholds, which were the only real structures in the game, were notorious for really leading nowhere. A dungeon might contain a mob spawner and chests, but no entrance or exit, buried under layers of stone. Mine shafts often spawned, floating in midair, or split into dozens of disconnected tunnels that defied logic. Strongholds, particularly before their revamp, were labyrinthian dead ends, filled with doors to nowhere and staircases that ended abruptly in stone walls. The architecture of these places were rudimentary and ultimately nonsensical, suggesting something abandoned or forsaken. Unlike designed levels in most games where every hallway and room serves a purpose, Minecraft's generated structures offered no such assurances. This randomness gave rise to a subtle fear, the idea that something had once lived in these places, and whatever it was now gone. It wasn't just about loneliness, it was about dereliction. Players began to attribute motives and histories to these locations. Everything just generally felt unfinished. Unfinished features would also affect the mobs, and in early versions included strange quirks in their behavior that hinted at unfinished AI routes. Animals would walk in endless loops or spin rapidly in place, and zombies, I went over this, but villagers, when introduced, had no professions or interaction mechanics, just blank stares and aimless wandering. Their lack of purpose or dialogue led many players to view them as kind of soulless. Some even speculated that villagers were the remnants of earlier players, transformed or corrupted, especially given their humanoid forms and proximity to ruins or empty towns. Compounding this was the discovery of removed or unused textures. Data miners unearthed assets for creatures that never made it into the game, or were swiftly removed. One such example was the Beast Boy zombie skin, and others included humanoid forms with unusual color palettes. These ghost-like figures, while never officially implemented, became part of a growing lexicon of Minecraft's lost content. There was an uncertainty to it. While today's iteration of Minecraft is densely populated with villages, bastions, ancient cities, jungle temples, and whatnot, I don't even know how many things there are anymore. The alpha and beta stages offered almost none of that. The number of man-made structures or structures that suggested civilization were conspicuously limited. For several updates, the only naturally spawning structure in the game was the dungeon, a mossy cobblestone room containing a mob spawner and some loot within 2 chests. This sparse inclusion set a peculiar tone for exploration, one that felt less like stumbling upon the remnants of a lost world and more like uncovering a glitch. The dungeon was introduced as early as Minecraft Classic, but took its far more familiar form in the early alpha builds. It was a small, often inaccessible cube carved into the underground. The mossy cobblestone distinguished it visually, standing out sharply against the uniformly gray stone of the surrounding terrain. Players who encountered them weren't just facing a gameplay challenge, they were brushing up against something that felt, perhaps accidentally, loaded with meaning. The dungeons did not fit into any larger narrative or system. There were no explanations for why these rooms existed or why they constantly produced monsters. This absence of context made players imagine, what they're for. There's something unnerving about a world that appears handcrafted but refuses to explain itself. The dungeon, which has to be a man-made structure, became kind of a monolith. Its very presence broke the illusion that Minecraft's world was entirely natural. It suggested quietly but avoidantly that something had been here before the player. Even as Minecraft progressed into beta, the selection of naturally spawning structures remained slim. The next major addition was the Stronghold in Beta 1.8, coinciding with the introduction of the End Dimension. These strongholds were vast, confusing stone mazes embedded deep underground. Their architecture was more elaborate than the dungeons, complete with corridors and libraries and the likes. However, these were rare. Only a limited number spawned per world, and they were incredibly difficult to find without Eyes of Ender. The rarity and scale of the Stronghold intensified the sense that Minecraft's world had a forgotten history. The scarcity of structures wasn't merely a technical limitation. With only one or two types of meaningful locations to discover, most of the world was empty. And that emptiness didn't feel dull or lazy, it felt very intentional. It emphasized isolation. Modern Minecraft, while vast and rich with content, lacks this type of experiential gravity. The abundance of structures today can dilute their impact. Players now expect to see desert temples, pillager outposts, and nether fortresses. These locations are densely woven into the world, sometimes appearing within short walking distances of each other. And while this boosts engagement, especially for younger players or those seeking faster rewards, it simultaneously erodes the feeling that the game world is unknowable. There is less room for silence, fewer moments that feel like stumbling upon something you weren't meant to see. From a design standpoint, the limited structure count in early Minecraft had created a somewhat ambiguous tone. It invited interpretation without offering resolution. The economic world building meaning through omission, is something that psychological horror and speculative fiction do. In finance terms, it's akin to how minimalistic design and user interfaces can produce greater focus and clarity, rather than the overstimulation seen in more crowded dashboards. The fewer elements you place in a world, the more gravity each one carries. Players weren't just rewarded with loot or progression, they were rewarded with atmosphere. The simple act of descending into a moss-covered chamber could evoke questions about the logic of the game itself. The limited structures operated less like conventional gameplay features and more like narrative seeds, hooks for imagined lore. In this way, early Minecraft unwittingly positioned itself adjacent to the ARG genre. It didn't tell you a story, but it left enough room for one to grow. It is no coincidence that so much Minecraft horror content, both fan-created and emergent from the community, centers around this era. Herobrine sightings originating from white eyes and empty strongholds and abandoned mineshafts, they all derive their narrative power from a lack of explanation. When a player found something strange in early Minecraft, it couldn't be immediately dismissed as an Easter egg or feature. It had to be investigated, and that curiosity, combined with the scarcity of known content, created an incredible story, one that I think is thoroughly lost in modern Minecraft.